Right. Thank you for joining us for this evening's event. I'm Emily. I'm one of the event hosts here at Powell's. Just have a few quick housekeeping announcements before we begin. I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events online at powells.com. And if you don't already, please consider following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Tonight, we are so very excited to welcome Nicole Perlroth and John Markoff. Nicole is an award-winning cybersecurity journalist for the New York Times, where her work has been optioned for both film and television. She previously covered venture capital and startups for Forbes magazine. She's a regular lecturer at the Stanford Graduate School of Business and a graduate of Princeton University and Stanford University. She lives with her husband and son in the Bay Area, but increasingly prefers life off the grid in a cabin in the woods. Her new book, This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends, is the untold story of the cyber weapons market, the most secretive, invisible, government-backed market on Earth, and a terrifying first look at the new kind of global warfare. Filled with spies, hackers, arms dealers, and a few unsung heroes, written like a thriller and a reference. Her new book is an astonishing feat of journalism based on years of reporting and hundreds of interviews. Joining her in conversation this evening is John Markoff. He wrote about technology and science for the New York Times beginning in March 1988 as the paper's national computer writer. He retired from the paper in 2017 to write a biography of Stuart Brand. In 2013, he was awarded a Pulitzer Prize in explanatory reporting as part of a New York Times project on labor and automation. He's also written 6 books, including What the Dormouse Said, How the 60s Counterculture Shaped the Personal Computer Industry, and Machines of Loving Grace, The Quest for the Common Ground Between Humans and Robots. So this event will also include an author Q&A. If you have a question, please use the Q&A module at the bottom of your screen. If you don't see the button, try clicking more. As well, if someone else has typed a question that you would like to know the answer to, please upvote that question by clicking the thumbs up button. And perhaps most importantly, please consider supporting Nicole and Powell's by purchasing a copy of her new book from us. I'll be sharing a link to buy This Is How They Tell Me the World End, as well as John's books, in the chat a couple of times this evening. Nicole, John, it's such a pleasure to welcome you. Thank you both so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks a lot. So,
thank you.
Nicole, first let me say, I feel a little bit like Rip Van Winkle here doing this with you. And to put things in perspective, so I was the first cybercrime and internet reporter at the New York Times, but I left the internet beat for the Times in 1992. And I came back to Silicon Valley where I wrote about cybercrime through 2011, where you replaced me. So did I miss anything?
I think that was good. Yeah. There's a lot that happened in between.
In the last decade. I also noticed that I think, tell me if this is true, that your first New York Times story at the end of 2011, when you replaced me, included an interview with Kamala Harris, who was then the California AG. Do you remember that?
Yes. They promised
cool.
me that I wasn't going to have to write for a couple of weeks while I got my legs under me. And then they assigned me this story. There was some breaking privacy story. And somehow I knew Kamala's niece, Mina Harris, through a friend. And I just panicked, texted the mutual friend and said, could you ask your friend if her aunt might want to speak to the New York Times on this breaking privacy story? So my first interview ever at the New York Times was with Kamala Harris.
That's very cool. Have you touched base with her recently?
Well, I have a funny story, which is I used to work in this hallway that John knows. It was this dusty old hallway in the New York Times old bureau in San Francisco. And sitting down the hallway with me, my hallway mate was Nick Bilton, who's written a couple books about Twitter and the dark web. And one day he called and he said, do you think Kamala Harris would talk to me for the story I'm doing on, I think it was revenge porn. And so I said, yes, here's her contact information. So he sent an email and he gets this call back and he does this interview and he's on deadline. And at the end he says, okay, can you spell your last name? And she goes, H-A-R-R. And then he goes, okay, title. He goes, Attorney General of the state of California. He thought he was talking to her spokesperson the whole time. And I'll never forget him turning around and going, Oh my God, I just made Kamala Harris spell Harris, which is, the easiest to spell last name. So I saw her, I was out to lunch with Nick at work one day, and I saw her seated at the restaurant, and I was with Nick, and I said, I have to do this. So I walked up to her and I tapped her and I said, hi, I'm Nicole Perlroth, New York Times. We've spoken before. Do you remember that other New York Times reporter that made you spell out your last name and title? He's right here.
That's great.
And so we had a good laugh, and then I haven't talked to her since.
That's funny. I actually have a Kamala Harris story too. I was the foreman of the San Francisco grand jury sometime way back when she was the DA of San Francisco, and she was my DA while I was foreman of the.
Oh my gosh. Did you
a long
vote?
time.
Did you vote in her favor?
Well, no, her attorneys did all that. She showed up once to train us, and that was the last we saw of her. And she seemed a little checked out actually at the time. That's my main memory of Kamala from that time. So I wanted to begin at the beginning. So your book is about 0 days, and I have a little story to set up 0 days, because in 1991 there was this conference called the RSA Data Security Conference, and it started really small. And this was the rise of the .com era, and the internet was exploding. And after about 5 or 6 years, it was already huge. I mean, it turned into a monster conference, but I saw it getting bigger and bigger. And as it got bigger, computer security got worse, which was really kind of interesting dynamic, which was already playing out back then. But there was this one moment in probably 97 or 98 where I was the one reporter at a dinner with a bunch of the guys who were sort of CTOs of cybercrime companies, cybersecurity companies. And there was one moment in the dinner where somebody was joking about what a great business it was to be in, because if things were bad at the end of the quarter, you could just let a virus out. And I was sitting at a table and I saw people's eyes moving in like a really weird way. Like they were all looking at each other. Like this was more true than, and that's the world that you dived into. And so the very first thing I want to ask is, so we have a diverse audience, I'm sure. Would you explain what a 0 day is?
Yes. And I just want to add to that. When I took over the beat from John, I was this green reporter, and I asked him for his advice on everything from how to set up my contact lists and sources. And one thing you said to me, I'll never forget, you said, if people and companies could sue their cybersecurity software companies for malpractice, this industry would be bankrupt. It just does not work. It would be totally out of business. So, okay, to your question. So a 0 day is, and I apologize, this is going to be the most technical part of our conversation, I promise, but a 0 day is an unpatched flaw or bug or mistake in software code that if you, and let's just use the easiest example, if there is a flaw or a bug in your iPhone's iOS software, and I'm a hacker and I know how to write the code to exploit it, I could potentially use that 0 day, and once you've exploited it, it's called a 0 day exploit, to read your text messages, to turn on your camera, to turn on your microphone on your phone and listen to your conversations undetected. And so 0 day exploits have huge espionage potential, and governments all over the world are paying hackers for these 0 day exploits. But what that necessarily entails is not telling Apple about it, or not telling Microsoft if it's a 0 day in Microsoft Windows software. Because if a manufacturer finds out about it, they'll patch for it, and then they'll send you a software update and you'll run it on your phone and you're protected. So there is a hidden market for 0 day exploits where governments aren't the regulators, they are the clients. So they have no reason or incentive to regulate this market. And for a long time, what I discovered was they've been paying hackers, and going rate, by the way, for an iPhone iOS exploit that could get me into your phone remotely is $2.5 million. Although lately there's been new brokers on the market that work exclusively for the Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, who are now offering $3 million or higher. So we're really losing this market. These other governments have deep pockets too, and they're using those 0 day exploits not just to monitor terrorists or their adversaries. They are increasingly getting caught using these tools to spy on their own people and journalists all over the world. So I wanted to explore the zero-day market because it is the one thing that nobody in the business wanted to talk about.
Yeah. And so what was the line of reporting that led you into the book? I mean, what did you stumble across, or what did you find that piqued your
Well,
interest?
there had been murmurings of this market. Andy Greenberg, who's a terrific writer for Wired and used to work with me at Forbes magazine, did a terrific profile of a zero-day broker who's pretty famous. His name is the Gruck. I actually don't even know his real name or if his real name has been published. He's on Twitter. He has
I follow him on
100,000
Twitter.
followers. Yeah. He sounds very wise and like a sage on Twitter, but he wasn't that wise when Andy did the story because he basically laid out the dynamics of this market that no one wanted to talk about and posed next to a giant duffel bag full of cash for the story. And so he would later say that he was only speaking off the record, but of course he was happy to pose for this photo. And what happened, I learned, and no one knew about this after the story, was he's South African, he lives in Thailand, he was visited by Thai police, government stopped doing business with him. No one wanted to buy zero-day exploits from someone who was going to talk to a journalist. And I tried to reach out to him a couple times when I got to the New York Times, and every time he blew me off. But I knew that this market existed because Andy had done this story on it. But what led me into this market was two things. One, in 2013, I got brought into this storage closet at the Times, and I think John was in it at one point with me. But we got a slice at the New York Times of the Snowden documents. Edward Snowden was the NSA contractor who made off with tens of thousands of NSA top secret and sometimes classified documents. And The Guardian, which is a British newspaper, or was then a British newspaper, now they have an office in the United States. I learned that they didn't have the same free speech protections that we have here in the United States. And at one point, their version of the NSA, the GCHQ, came to the Guardian's headquarters and watched and forced them to take whirring blades to their hard drives that they had gotten from Snowden. But in the backdrop, they had been able to successfully smuggle a copy of the hard drive to the New York Times. And they were able to tap into our terrific First Amendment lawyers that we have at the Times and our resources in the United States and our free speech protections. But there were a couple ground rules. So the ground rules, one of them was we had to work in a room that had no windows because the GCHQ told them that foreign governments could shoot lasers at windows and listen to everything they were saying and pick up audio and potentially even capture visuals of the documents. So what was interesting about that was the New York Times was designed by the architect Renzo Piano as a model for full transparency. So if you've ever walked by the New York Times headquarters in Manhattan, you know that every floor and every conference room is floor to ceiling glass. We don't have any rooms that don't have windows in them, with the exception of bathrooms and Arthur Sulzberger's personal storage closet. So for several months, I worked out of that storage closet with Scott Shane, who was our national security reporter, and some of the editors and a team from The Guardian and ProPublica. And we were assigned to work on very specific stories. My story was to see how far the NSA had come in cracking digital encryption. And what I saw in those documents that really was not explained in any kind of useful context was references to backdoors or ways into pretty much any technology you could name. Facebook, iPhones, Androids, Blackberries, Cisco routers, Oracle, Huawei, everything. But it didn't explain where those backdoors came from, whether they were developed internally at the NSA or whether they came from somewhere else. But I did see these littered references to our commercial partners and our security partners that provide some of these capabilities. So I knew slightly a little bit about this market, the gray market for zero-day exploits. And it seemed like there was just this tenuous connection that maybe some of these backdoors were coming from this market. And then the other thing that led me to this was 6 months earlier, before I set foot in that closet, I had been to a conference. It was in Miami. It's called S4. It's every year. And it's just focused on a sub-slice of the industry, which focuses on hacking into industrial control systems, the systems that touch our grid, nuclear plants, autonomous vehicles. And this was really focused on finding ways into those systems and ways to hack those systems. And there was a pair of Italians there at the conference. Their names were Luigi and Donato, and they had just crafted this startup called Revon. And their business model was, they said, they sold zero-day exploits in industrial control software to governments. So I was invited out to dinner on the first night of the conference with these Italians, and also with another person, Ralph Langner, who's a very German industrial control security specialist.
Mr.
You've
Stetson.
probably met him. Yes, he was the first one to identify and call out the authors behind a major attack by the US and Israel that John covered for the Times called Stuxnet, which took out the centrifuges at the Iranian nuclear plant. And so we're sitting at this dinner, and I knew no one wanted to talk about which governments they sold these tools to, but I was always curious, which governments would they not sell these tools to? And these weren't, a way to spy on your iPhone. These were ways to get into uranium centrifuges and the grid and transportation and oil pipelines and gas pipelines. And so we're sitting at this dinner, and I finally got the liquid courage to ask, so Luigi, Donato, who don't you sell your zero-day exploits to? Or, Iran, China. And Luigi was the one who spoke the better English of the two. And he just sort of stared at his salmon dinner and didn't say a word for a really long time. I mean, we're talking like a minute or two. And in that time, I could just feel Ralph Langner's jaw clenching and his fists clenching, because he spent his career trying to lock up these industrial control systems so we would not have a cataclysmic cyber attack on any of these systems. So finally, he just erupted in the silence, and he turned to me and he said, Nicole, these guys are young. They have no idea what they're doing. They have no idea where this is going to go. And then he turned back to Luigi, and pardon my language, but he said, but go ahead, tell us about your fucking salmon. And it was just very clear to me that there was a lot that was being unsaid at that dinner, and that that the fact that people were selling methods of hacking into our critical infrastructure just struck me as totally insane. And the fact that there was no accountability, that no one knew who the customers were, that there was no regulation, always struck me as just very insane, on its head. And so when I was sitting in that Snowden closet, I thought about that fucking salmon every single day. And I decided, after I left that closet and after I did that story on encryption for the Times, that I would go find out what exactly this market was all about, who people were selling to. Did the United States participate in this market? Were we, the taxpayers, funding our own insecurity because these vulnerabilities weren't getting fixed, not just as our data was racing online, but as our critical infrastructure was too?
Let me step back to one of the things you said first. When you talk about the Saudis being willing to pay millions of dollars, do you have any sense, if you take an operating system like Windows or iOS, how many vulnerabilities are out there in terms of product? And on the other side, how many customers are there? Are we talking hundreds on both sides of the equation? Do you have any sense of the scale or scope of the market?
Well, that was really hard to come by. Numbers were really hard to come by. But my sense from interviews was that there used to be a lot more vulnerabilities. Before these companies really realized that they had to start focusing on security around the turn of the century, after there were these huge attacks involving Microsoft software, they started spending more effort on security. So I was told that in the early days, vulnerabilities were everywhere. They were, you could find a vulnerability in Microsoft Windows software for pennies on the dollar. But as they started pouring more money into security, as Apple started a practice of what we call sandboxing, where if you're an app on iOS, on the iPhone, you can't grab data from another app. You're really limited in how much access you have to a user's iPhone. once they started putting those protections in place, it became a lot harder to find a really good zero-day exploit or string of zero-day exploits that would get you into someone's iPhone remotely. And once that became harder, the prices for these zero-day exploits that governments were willing to pay kept going up, particularly after Snowden, when these companies started adding more and more encryption around their products to assure their foreign customers that they weren't just a conduit for the NSA. The other thing that really impacted the market was Stuxnet. So once the US and Israel hacked into this Iranian nuclear facility around 2007, it was a huge success. You know, it was stealthy. They destroyed 1,000 centrifuges. It set back Iran's nuclear ambitions back years. It arguably got Tehran to the negotiating table. But inevitably, as happens in a lot of the attacks that we cover, that code escaped. It got out and it circled the world. It got into company systems like Chevron in the United States. It didn't do anything because it had been engineered so specifically to look for the centrifuge designs at Natanz that it didn't do any damage. But it allowed governments all over the world to dissect it. And once that happened, it really opened up these other governments' eyes to the potential of code, not just for espionage and surveillance, but for destruction. And every government, you know, it went from something like a dozen, I'm told, to after Stuxnet. By the time I was looking into this around 2013, someone did a study at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, where they estimated that about 100 governments were now pursuing these offensive programs, and zero-day exploits formed the raw material, the crucial raw material for these programs. But these days, I'm told, you know, most governments, because these things are so cheap for a government, most governments, whether they appear to have enemies or not, are pursuing this market, or buying zero-day exploits, or stockpiling them, with the exception of maybe Antarctica. I mean, in the course of researching this book, I discovered Finland, you know, the country I say of reindeers and saunas, was trying to get into this market and buying spyware from Israeli spyware deals who participate in the zero-day exploit market, because Finland shares a border with Russia, and Russia has been more aggressive over the past few years. So, you know, you don't think about it, but even countries you would never suspect are paying hackers for these tools.
So what's the backstory of your title?
Oh, it's not that exciting, except I was in the shower one day and it came to me. Just, this is how they tell me the world ends. And, you know, the larger story is that when I started on this beat, when I took it over from you, everyone was warning of a cyber Pearl Harbor, you know, that someday soon we were going to have this attack, this cataclysmic cyber-induced kinetic attack that was going to take down the grid or cause explosions or send airplanes into buildings or into each other through a hack of the air traffic control. And I always asked these people who made these predictions, okay, well then how long do you think it'll be before that actually happens? And they always had the same answer, which is 18 to 24 months. It was always 18 to 24 months. You know, just long enough to add some that I would forget if they were wrong, but also close enough to add some urgency to it. And I was really skeptical because, as you know, the cybersecurity community had tried to scare the bejesus out of us for so long to sell their mousetraps. And we hadn't seen an attack of that magnitude yet. But over the last 10 years, we've gotten as close as we have ever been, especially as we put more and more of our infrastructure online. And so at the end of the book, you know, I say, on the one hand, we are closer than we've ever been. On the other hand, all these warnings about a cyber Pearl Harbor are really a distraction from where we already are, which is in more of a pandemic of cybersecurity, where everything that could be intercepted already has been. You know, our intellectual property, our power plants have been intercepted by Russia. Cyber criminals have hijacked our hospitals and our towns and cities like Baltimore. And, you know, Iranian hackers, we've caught them mucking around our dams, you know, trying to figure out how to unleash the locks on our dams. So we're in a pretty precarious place. But the reason I liked This Is How They Tell Me the World Ends is it gives me a little bit of distance from the people that I was so skeptical of in the beginning of this beat, who were constantly trying to knock me over the head that we were, any day now, we were going to have this cataclysmic attack.
So before I have a serious question, I have to ask one more light question. You have a very interesting photo on the book jacket. Did you tell me, did you do that intentionally? It's very noirish, I thought.
Yes, I had, there was a photographer I knew, Christian Hoogstedt, who had done a photo like that of an actor whose name I'm forgetting. And I asked him if he would take my author photo because I hate the photo that they use at the New York Times of me. So we went out and we were in front of the LA, near the LA Design Center. And just shined a red light on me while I was standing in front of these lights and took the photo. But yeah, it's very cyber-esque, so
I thought it was
felt very fitting.
Yes, but so you tell the story of a guy named Jim Gossler, and I really wanted to. I mean, and you describe him as the godfather of offensive cyber warfare. Someone who traveled between the NSA and Sandia Labs. He's an extremely interesting character, and he gets at a lot of. I mean, could you tell us sort of, how did you get him to open up? I mean, I found that there's a lot of Gossler in there, and he was at the heart of everything, is my understanding at the beginning.
Well, you're partly responsible for this because
I didn't say
one
that.
of the
I didn't get him to open up. You did.
Okay. Well, for everyone listening, the most intimidating part about this book was I wanted to tell this story in a very human way. And ideally, I wanted to structure it so that every chapter represented some slice of this market, the hackers, the brokers, and then I wanted to get inside governments to understand, where did these offensive cyber operations start? When did they start seeing the value in a zero-day exploit? And when did they start kickstarting these programs? So I knew it was going to be a huge challenge to get someone from inside the NSA or the intelligence apparatus to talk to me. And I didn't even know who that person was. And I was brewing about this one day at the San Francisco Bureau, and I mentioned it to John, and he said, "Oh, you should talk to, I think there's this guy, the godfather of offensive cyber war. I forget his name, but something like Jim." And I immediately Googled, and I didn't find anything, but I kept Googling, and I finally found Jim Gossler, and he had just retired at Sandia. And in his little tiny blurb on the Sandia newsletter that was on the internet, it talked about, and not those words, but it basically insinuated that he was a big player in helping the United States develop its offensive cyber warfare programs, and that most of everything he did was classified. So I just called him. I just looked him up and I called him up, and I told him I was doing this book, and I told him I wanted to understand when, how the government got into this market and started developing exploits, not just for surveillance, but for battlefield preparations. And he said, "Oh, you need to go read this report. It's called Project Gunman. It was declassified a couple years ago. I was one of the irritants that made sure it was declassified." And he pointed me to this thing and he said, "Read that and essentially call me back." And so I found the report, I read through it, and it was this fabulous, interesting story about an incident that took place in 1983, 1984 at the US Embassy in Moscow, where everyone at the embassy began to suspect that everything they were doing and saying, even their unspoken communications, was being relayed to the Soviets. And we got a tip from the French who said, "We just found this bug in our teleprinter machines, and you should assume that you also have a bug in your machines." And they also tipped off the Italian embassy, and lo and behold, the Italian embassy found a bug in their teleprinter machines. And Reagan ended up approving this 6-month effort called Project Gunman, top secret at the time, to send NSA analysts to the embassy, collect every piece of equipment at the embassy, copy machines, typewriters, printers, teleprinters, crypto gear, and get it back to Fort Meade, which in itself was this huge operation because they didn't want the Soviets somehow intercepting the equipment on its way back to Fort Meade and removing the bugs that they had put in these systems. And so That alone took 100 days. And then it took another 100 days for them to x-ray every last piece of equipment until they found this tiny, how do you pronounce it? A magnetometer. I can never pronounce it. In the back coil of one of their typewriters. And it was recording every last disturbance in the Earth's magnetic field, relaying it to this tiny electronic unit next to it, which was cataloging it and sending it on to this electronic, this radio unit that they just later discovered had been hidden in the embassy's chimney. And once they discovered that and they went back and did an inventory of all their typewriters, they realized the Russians had been inside our embassy typewriters for something like 7 or 8 years. And what that did was just opened the NSA's eyes to OSHIT. If we don't start hacking into anything that plugs into a wall, we are going to not only lose the Cold War, but we are never going to catch up to these espionage capabilities of the Soviets and other adversaries who surely are going to pursue these same capabilities. And so I read the report, I called Jim Gossler back, and he basically said, that's what did it. That was the big catalyst. After that, the NSA started pursuing it's searching for 0 days and every kind of software that hit the market. He would never talk to me about anything classified, but what he did tell me was that they set up a taxonomy at the NSA, and at the bottom were countries that couldn't find a 0-day exploit if their life depended on it, but could use their cash to buy them from hackers. Just above them were nation states that would pay for these capabilities, but also tried to train their own people to find them themselves. And then above them were the top dogs, as he called them, nation states who had the skills to find 0-day exploits, implant them in the world's software and hardware and make hay, as he called it. And then at the very top were the guys who could do this at scale in the supply chain, get into the supply chain, into the microchips that make their way into our phones and everything else, and collect that data at scale. And basically, he didn't say as much, but he insinuated that through his tenure in the intelligence community, he made sure the United States was at the top of this heap. First at the NSA, and then at CIA, where he was tapped to lead their clandestine intelligence office, technology office, where I went back and I read a lot of the accounts of his underlings and I spoke with some of them. And they basically said that he was the guy you would go to when you needed to solve the impossible. When you needed to break into a system that could not be broken into, you would always go to Jim Gossler. And in addition to that, at the CIA, he basically recruited spies and told them, don't be afraid of these digital espionage capabilities. Don't be afraid they're going to replace you. This is just a huge compliment to your work as CIA spies. You can be a janitor, you can be a spy or secretary, and all you have to do is plug the USB stick into these systems, and then you're going to get all this data that it took us 20 years to get out of file cabinets 10 years ago. So, he basically, it was first through him, and then it was through his underlings. And then when I went back to him and said, you are the godfather of offensive cyber war, he's so humble that he's like, oh, no, I was part of a team. He's so humble. And I didn't want to pin this on him if he wasn't the guy. So over the last 10 years, I would fact check this every opportunity I could. I was at the Aspen Security Conference, for example, and I was seated next to Michael Hayden, who was the director of the NSA and CIA. And I said, so, who would you say is the United States godfather of cyber war? He was like, oh, Jim Gossler, And so I was just fact checking as I went. And
also tell a remarkable story about I guess when Robert Morris Sr., who was the chief scientist of the NSA at that time, invited him, he did this demo. Which takes you, if you go all the way back, it takes you all the way forward to solar winds, I think, in a way. It's very profound about sort of protecting supply chains. Tell us about the demo that he got him sort of in the door at NSA.
Well, he was always this natural hacker. He was working at Sandia Labs at first, and he said he would work in the lab and he'd look for vulnerabilities in our nuclear arsenal. And then at night, he'd go home and tinker around with video games and that kind of thing. And he wanted to prove a point to the people at Sandia that these vulnerabilities existed and that they could be exploited to place implants into software and code and spy on people. So he set up a series of training exercises, 2 training exercises, where he put an implant in an application that they used at Sandia, and then he challenged the engineers at Sandia to find it. And the first one, he said, was really easy to find. The second one was a little bit harder. Well, no one even found the first one. They didn't even bother trying to find the second one. And it took him something like 8-hour days to just whiteboard out how he did this and explain it to everyone. And they ultimately told him, never do these training exercises again, because if you do it again, everyone here is going to quit. It was so frustrating. But word of this exercise got back to Robert Morris Sr. at the NSA, and they invited him to Fort Meade to talk to him about these exercises. And it was at one of those conversations where Jim asked Robert Morris Sr., how confident, how many lines of code would you have to have in an application before you could be confident that you could find a 0-day exploit essentially in the code, or an implant in the code? And Robert Morris Sr. said, I think, an application with 1,000 lines of code, I think I would be pretty confident that I could find the implant. And so I think Jim did his demonstration and no one found it. And that was in an application with something like 1,000 lines of code. And so throughout his career, he basically, helped the NSA and then later the CIA find these 0-day exploits and exploit them not only in individual applications, but in the supply chain. And the whole time it really gnawed at him that we were just adding more and more complexity to our daily lives, adding more software, more lines of code, millions of lines of code in the case of a modern day car these days. And he knew that you could never be confident that there wasn't an implant in any of the technology we use today. And that ended up being his primary motivation for speaking to me, because at this point, now that he's retired, he wants to get the message out that we are woefully behind when it comes to defense.
Yeah. Well, what's so interesting about that story is it's very evocative of something that was in the public, which was Ken Thompson's Turing lecture, which is called On Trusting Trust, where he basically does the same thing. It was always the example that everybody used of what Gossler was doing inside and then on the dark side, and it leads directly to. It leads directly, in my mind, to SolarWinds.
Yes.
The fear of the corruption of the supply chain and the way that it was corrupted was something that had been sort of laid out. Talk about Pearl Harbor and warning about something. It was there
Yes.
for everybody to see, and it happened anyway.
Yes, and Jim Gossler was giving me reading assignments. Every time I spoke to him, I'd walk away with a list of homework. And the first thing after Project Gunman he assigned me was to go back and read Ken Thompson's lecture, Reflections on Trusting Trust, which essentially just said, unless you wrote the source code to an application yourself, or all the source code that makes its way into your devices, you can never be confident that there's not a malicious or a spy in it, essentially, which is exactly what is happening right now with the big Russian attack on government systems.
So you said Russian, and everybody says it's the Russians, and I read everything religiously, and I have not seen one piece of reporting that gives me any confidence that it really is the Russians. Why do we think it's the Russians?
Well, just today, if you believe government officials, and I know we don't usually, but if you believe government officials, just today, Ann Neuberger, who's the Deputy National Security, the cyber director, said, yes, we think it's the Russians, but no one has actually pinned it on the group or shown any evidence to suggest it's the group that we think it is, which is a unit of the Russian intelligence called the SVR, that we know very well because they hacked the White House and the State Department back in 2014, 2015. And what was memorable about that attack was just how impossible it was to get them out of the systems, even when we had found each other in the network. People who remediated that attack told me it was like hand-to-hand digital combat. But just to get to your question, the attribution on this is extremely fuzzy. It was first caught by FireEye, a security company, And they did the right thing, which was they called together a bunch of reporters and they said, this is what's happened. We've been broken into by a nation state. They've stolen our tools, and we'll keep you posted. And then on background, employees of the company said, we think it's Russia, but we don't know exactly which group it is, which is odd for FireEye because they are so good at attribution, and they are the ones who in many ways came up with this whole taxonomy of nation state threat groups that they find in all sorts of customer systems. But for the most part, I think the attribution in the beginning, at least, came from the fact that this attack was so sophisticated, that it was so much more sophisticated than the attacks we've seen out of China, that it could only be the Russians. But there's still so much to be mined there.
And it's like it's this wonderful riddle. The thing that's most fascinating is that apparently our intelligence community did not know about this. And so this brings me to the question of, if our offensive cyber is so good, if this was really a gold mine that the Russians were extracting all of this stuff from the American network, you'd think it would have filtered into the Russian intelligence community, which I would think we would have penetrated. So why would we have not known about it?
Such a good question. I mean, for the last 4 or 5 years, we know that we have been not only inside Russia's systems and beyond just human intelligence, but we've been aggressively hacking the Russian grid. That was a story I wrote with our colleague David Sanger, and the National Security Council essentially confirmed it to us at the time. But we've been hacking these systems, and the philosophy was that we would set up kind of an early warning system to get a sense of what they were up to, so we could defend against attacks before they hit us here in the United States. And it is a stunning intelligence failure that they did not detect this attack on our own government systems, that they had to get tipped off by FireEye, who only learned about it in the course of their own hack. And in rewinding that attack, they learned that hackers had gotten in through a technology company in Texas called SolarWinds and used SolarWinds as a conduit. They got in through their software updates, which were just this backdoor to get into the Department of Energy, State, Justice, Treasury, Commerce, Department of Homeland Security, the nuclear labs. So it's just a stunning failure, but I'm already forgetting your question.
I was asking the question of whether we were whether we were actually as good as we said we are. Say we are.
Right. So I think my take on this is, and I think this is my big conclusion from doing this book, we are still the world's top dog. We are still the most advanced offensive player in cyberspace. But I say that only because of Stuxnet, because that attack was so sophisticated. They got into an air-gapped nuclear facility. They jumped from industrial control systems, Siemens software, into Windows systems into Siemens software. That was the first time I think that had ever happened before. And then they used code to spin these centrifuges. Some cases spun them up and then sat back for 27 days so they wouldn't get detected. In some cases, they slowed it down and then stepped back for 27 days so they wouldn't get detected. And all the while, anytime an engineer was looking at his screen, everything looked as if it was functioning normally, when in the background, they were destroying their centrifuges. And it was all designed to look like a natural accident. Nothing we have seen, or I at least have covered since Stuxnet, has come anywhere close to that. And I also say, we're constantly covering Russian attacks, Iranian attacks, Chinese attacks, North Korean attacks, because cybersecurity researchers are detecting those and they're calling them out and we write about them. But we're never really covering NSA attacks unless there is a giant leak like the Snowden leaks, or someone hacks the NSA. And I think it's not because I'm avoiding covering the NSA. I think it's because the NSA is so good at staying stealthy. But just because we're the biggest, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying, once upon a time, there was this operation called GhostNet. Nobody ever knew what it was, but I suspect that we actually did stumble across an NSA operation, but that's another story. A long time ago. You just mentioned something indirectly. We have some audience questions I want to get to, but one last story from you. One of your stories with Sanger, irritated the former president of the United States. Can you tell us about sort of raising the ire of former President Trump?
Well, I already stumbled across it, but so David Sanger came to me, I think this was in 2019, and all these dates start to blur together. But he came to me and he said, I'm hearing some whispers that the authorities have changed under Trump, that before it used to be under Obama, that when Cyber Command, which is essentially the Pentagon's hackers that pull off computer network attacks, cyber attacks, when they were going to pull off an attack on, say, the Iranian grid, Obama would have to approve each of these attacks one by one. That was the rule. And David had heard that under Trump, they had changed the rule. They'd loosened the rule up so that Cyber Command and NSA, they didn't have to go get presidential approval for these attacks. And he said, I think we should look into this and find out how this is actually playing out on the ground. And so we kind of parted ways, and then we both learned that, yes, the approvals had changed. Cyber Command did not require presidential approval, and that under Bolton, especially, they were pursuing this very aggressive form of active defense where we were, in retaliation for Russia's attacks on our own grid and the elections in 2016, we were hacking into Russia's grid, and we were actually doing it in such a way that we were making quite a loud show of it to tell Russia, we are in your systems, and should you do anything to our grid here in the United States, we will turn around and do the same thing to you, essentially mutually assured destruction, the digital version. And so both of us were able to source this. We spent several months on it, and we were able to confirm it, and we came back together and we put together a draft. And then David went to the spokesperson at the National Security Council and said, here's everything in this draft. We're going to publish this in the New York Times. So usually, as you know, when we do this, there's some negotiation that happens, or they tell us that we're going to have blood on our hands if we publish these stories. And then we will talk to them. Usually we publish anyway, but in some cases we have held on to stories for longer for when they have made a good case. And in this case, they said, oh no, we have no problems with you publishing this story. It was very clear that they wanted these attacks to be known. They wanted Russia to know we were in their systems and that we could turn off their lights too, if we chose or were given the right trigger. So one of the things, though, we learned was that not only did they not have to tell Trump that they were doing this, they had actually gone out of their way not to tell Trump that they were doing this because they were worried he would somehow countermand these attacks or tip off Putin or Putin's deputies to the fact we were doing these attacks because of how he had acted in meetings with the Russian foreign minister when they had come to the White House, and he had leaked some intelligence that we'd collected from our Israeli allies in those conversations. And it was a major diplomatic brouhaha there with our allies. So they went out of their way not to tell Trump, and we had that in the story. It was, paragraph 6 or something. We said, the US has been hacking into Russia's grid. This has really enshrined the grid as a legitimate target for cyber attacks. And not only that, but they don't have to get President Trump's approval. And they are not telling President Trump about these attacks because of fears that he might countermand them. So we ran the story, and David tells us better than I do, but he was at dinner. I was on a bicycle ride, and all of a sudden my phone started blowing up. And it was because people noticed that Trump had tweeted out that our story was, quote, a virtual act of treason. And I think the lawyers caught David while he was at dinner and said, you better look at this. And it was the first time, we were used to failing New York Times an enemy of the people, and him calling out Maggie Haberman and some of our individual reporters, but it was the first time he'd used the word treason. And to our publisher's eternal credit, he wrote an op-ed. He called up the Wall Street Journal and said, I'd like to publish this op-ed. And in it, he really addressed this. He said, once you've used the word treason, which is a crime punishable by death, how much further do you plan to take this? And, after that, for David and I, when we sort of traded notes on this, we weren't, fear, we weren't scared for our own lives or anything like that. But we did, we did open up the MAGA trolls on Twitter and that kind of thing. And we got all sorts of fun emails. But what we were really worried about was, what kind of pass does this language give to authoritarian governments, or even, allies like Saudi Arabia, which clearly ordered that hit on Jamal Khashoggi. And one of the incidents that our publisher brought up was really troubling, which was a reporter, a colleague of ours in Egypt, who had published this fantastic story about the Egyptians basically mistaking this Italian graduate student as a spy, torturing him, killing him, and dumping him on the side of a highway. And the Egyptians were so upset about this story. And our reporter got a call, or sorry, I think the publisher got a call from someone at the US Embassy in Cairo. And they said, get your reporter out of Egypt. They're about to send security services to his house to arrest him. And we'd gotten these calls before. And usually the New York Times is able to get our reporters out with help from American diplomats. But the troubling part about this phone call that was different was the diplomat said, and the embassy doesn't plan on assisting him. They'd essentially told the Egyptian security services that they could go ahead and arrest him. And so what this person was doing was essentially whistleblowing and saying, and what they suggested was, we know your reporter is a dual Irish citizen, call the Irish embassy. And it ended up being the Irish embassy that got our colleague out of Egypt. And so, Sulzberger mentioned that in the op-ed and said, clearly these governments did feel like they had a pass to not only go after their own journalists and dissidents like Jamal Khashoggi, but to go after our own American journalists, because we were the enemy of the people, according to Trump. And so that was that story.
That's troubling. I wanted, if we could ask our Powell's host to come back and perhaps share some of the questions. Hi.
Hey. So we've got a few audience questions here for you. The first one is from Karen Perlroth. I don't know if that's a relative.
My mom. That's my mom. Hi, Mom.
She asks, how did you ever ingratiate yourself into the hacking community? I'm particularly thinking of your vodka story. Could you expand on that? How did you get people to speak to you?
Well, I don't know. I think in the beginning, I was this green reporter. I had not covered cybersecurity, and I was able to go to people and genuinely in earnest say, I don't know anything about this space. And people were more than happy to educate me in those days and point me in the right direction and make introductions. And in many ways, it was those early days that was the easiest time to make sources. It got more complicated as the attacks that I was covering were becoming nation state attacks. And in that case, it wasn't really so much the hacking community as security researchers that specialized in tracking these nation state groups. I think the vodka story my mom is referring to, I don't even know if it was vodka, but I was invited to this Russian security conference in Puerto Rico, and no one would talk to me. And I think I took a bottle of vodka and I put it on my arm and I drink it like this to prove that I was, I could hang with them. And after that, they were definitely much more open with me. But, that was a silly story. I think in general, the hacking community, it's almost like a bit of a misnomer. You have cyber criminals, you have security researchers, and I feel like I have, at this point, have security researchers on speed dial. And I'm constantly calling people like John Holtquist at FireEye and just saying one word, just help. And, he's spending all his time tracking these guys. And so you just learn to know who's good, who wants to sell you something, and who to just not pick up the phone from at all. But for the most part, I think there's this understanding that for the most part, these security researchers and journalists are on the same team, and that we want to track down these attacks. We want to draw awareness to this threat that a lot of people, think just goes over their head, or they want to ignore it. And so they see journalists in some ways as a real asset to translate the threat to the public. And so in some ways we're aligned, sometimes we're not aligned, and that's more difficult. When one of them gets hacked, like when FireEye got hacked, everyone kind of, they did official press calls and then they sort of shut down. But yeah, I don't know if I've answered your question, Mom, but we can talk about it over dinner sometime.
The next question is from Lisa H. And I think you touched on this a bit when you're talking about defense, but she asks, how do you mitigate, regulate, and monitor 0 days?
How do you mitigate, regulate, and monitor 0 days? Well, that's kind of the magic of a 0 day, is if no one knows about it, then you can sort of use it undetected and untethered. It's really like having an invisible superpower, is what I say in the book. If you know how to exploit it, then you really do have invisible superpowers. You can get into these systems undetected. Where they get caught is when someone discovers some other additional behavior, usually on their systems. Someone notices that someone gets into an account that they weren't supposed to get into, or tried to set up a new two-factor authentication account that was not supposed to have that kind of access. And then once you unwind those attacks, you realize that, oh, they got in this way. And clearly there was a hole in this software. And once that hole is known, then you inform the software manufacturer, they roll out a patch. And there's always this very critical window, by the way, which is why I always tell people, run your software updates. Because when software companies like Microsoft announce that they're going to patch for something, they actually have Patch Tuesday where they roll out all these patches. There is a window where cyber criminals and security researchers, for good reason, test these weaknesses that have not been patched. They look around and see which systems have not been patched and exploit them. And so there's this really critical period once the patch gets rolled out, and when hackers just go for it and try and prey on as many systems as they can. And you just hope that people run their software updates and patch their systems as quickly as possible, so that that window is as short as possible.
That's fascinating. So that's why you always click the update button. It's good to know.
Yes, don't ignore your software update prompt.
The next question is from Frederick Vial, who asks, you mentioned how 0 day exploits are constructs foreign governments are unwilling to discuss due to their own private interests, even participating in their demand and sales. Considering the media's vast technological capabilities in its own right, do you feel that the media may also, to some extent, be complicit in tempering its response to these cybersecurity issues, since many of the specifics surrounding them are not on the forefront of mainstream news? And if so, why?
Okay, that's a difficult one. So read me the second part of the question again. Sorry.
Yeah. Let's see. Considering the media's vast technological capabilities in its own right, do you feel the media may also, to some extent, be complicit in tempering its response to these cybersecurity issues, since many of the specifics surrounding them are not on the forefront of mainstream news? And if so, why?
Well, first of all, I'm not very technologically capable. My husband jokes that I can't even get the remote to work. And the New York Times, we are a digital publication in every sense of the word these days, except we do have the print paper. But we're not technologically sophisticated in that. I don't understand that part of the question. But what I will say is, it's very hard for journalists to translate for the public what these threats are, how they impact people in a visceral way. And a great example of that is this attack that we're unwinding right now on government systems, where it appears to be designed for espionage. We now know how they got in, which was they broke into an American software company and used that company's software updates as a backdoor into these systems. And we think that they were after emails and strategy planning documents and that kind of thing, espionage. But we also know that Russia has used that same access to decimate networks, to turn off the lights in Ukraine a couple times. They've pulled off cyber attacks there that shut off the power in a couple instances. So we know that that is a real threat. It is no longer a theoretical threat. And with the access that these hackers had in this attack that we suspect is Russia, it would only be 1 or 2 clicks away from destruction. And it's really hard to translate the seriousness of this attack when no one really feels it. Of course, if it became a destructive attack, people would see, oh, wow, this is impacting me in a very visceral way. But until that happens, it just feels so distant. And it's really hard in the media to communicate the severity of these threats and just how pervasive it is without scaring the hell out of people, but also because you don't want to overhype it. You don't, if it's not destruction, you don't want to call it a cyber attack or act of war, because that's not what it is. And actually, it's very interesting because we pull off these attacks on the software supply chain in other countries. And so what the Biden administration is essentially faced with now is, how do you respond to an attack that you yourself have pulled off successfully for years? And also, how do you pull off retaliatory strike on a nation state when you're not even confident that you've eradicated them from your systems, and you know that they could wipe data on all of these systems in response, and you're not confident you found every last backdoor in your systems? And if it's the group we think it is, when they hacked the State Department and the White House, one of the things that was really interesting for me was at one point I heard that they actually took over investigators' tools and manipulated them in a way so that they would not detect Russia's backdoors inside the State Department networks and White House systems. And so this group is very good. If it is the group that intelligence community thinks it is, it's going to be a long time before we can confidently say we've kicked them out of our networks.
I think we're just about out of time here, but I've got one more for you, if that works here. This one comes from Steve B, and he asks, is there any way that these zero-day vulnerabilities can be used for good?
Yes, they are. Well, and 2 things. One of them is, for a long time when hackers would find a 0-day in Microsoft Windows software, let's just pick on Microsoft for a second. Microsoft's initial response back in the 90s and early 2000s was to say, either thank you, we're going to ignore you, or they would send a lawyer to say, stop poking around our products or we'll sue you. And so hackers would come up with 0-day exploits as a proof of concept to say, look, this is serious. I could use a 0-day in your software to get into NASA's network. And to this day, the penetration testing community, the community that essentially what their job is they look for vulnerabilities on bank systems or companies' networks and try and get in, and then they can show their client, here's where you're vulnerable. We can help secure you. They use 0-day exploits to penetrate those companies' networks and systems. So they are what we call dual use technology. They are as useful for defensive penetration testing purposes as they are for offensive purposes. The other thing is, if you just take the example of Stuxnet, that attack used something like 7 0-day exploits in Microsoft software and Siemens industrial software to dismantle the centrifuges. But what was really interesting at that time, and I revisited this history for the book, was at that point, this was 2006, 2007, the death count in Iraq was going up and up. And Israel was essentially pressuring us into another war in Iran. And we were already overstretched in Afghanistan and Iraq. And this was George W.'s second term, and he had no appetite for getting into another war in the Middle East. And Israel was asking us for bunker buster bombs. They didn't have those capabilities, and that's what would have been required to really take out Natan's nuclear facility. And when the Pentagon would run simulations to see what would happen if we gave the United States these bombs and bombers, every simulation showed we would get dragged into World War III. And so Bush famously said, get me a third option. And the third option was using these 7 zero-day exploits to essentially use code to do what the Israelis wanted to do, which was set back Iran's nuclear ambitions. So those 7 zero-day exploits essentially kept Israeli jets on the ground. It kept us from getting into World War III. And so short term, I call it, a bloody masterpiece. It really was the digital version of the Manhattan Project without the bombs. But long term, it has had this boomerang effect of showing the world what could be done with code and how zero-day exploits could be used on our own systems. And unfortunately, we are among the most digitized nation on earth. And so in many ways, it doesn't matter that we're the biggest offensive player in this space, because we're also one of the most vulnerable because we are so wired up.
Wow. Sounds like there's a lot of possibilities both ways. It's terrifying. Well, I think we're out of time, but I just want to thank you both so much for being here. This was amazing. And thank you everyone out there for joining us. I hope we can welcome you to the store in person someday when it's safe to do so. Until then, this event will be on our YouTube channel. So if you'd like to watch it again or share it with your friends, it'll be there later this week. Until then, just take care and have a wonderful evening.
All right. Thank you so much, Emily. And thank you so much, John. And thanks to everyone who Zoomed in. I know everyone's sick of Zooming, but I really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Have a good
Bye.
night.